church always understood that there were two dimensions to being a Christian. There's first gospel messaging and second gospel neighboring. Gospel messaging can never be separated from the calls and the duties and demands on our lives to be a neighbor to those around us. But today in America, there is a pretty sharp divide between quote unquote conservative and liberal churches. The conservative churches will tend to emphasize what we could call gospel messaging, the preaching to personal conversion, morality, and life change. Whereas liberal churches tend to emphasize the social justice aspects of the gospel neighboring aspects. But when you actually study the Acts of the Apostles, when you read the words of Jesus Christ, and when you study the first 300 years of church history, you will note that gospel messaging and gospel neighboring were never separated. That the early Christians saw the union of these two things, that gospel neighboring was one of the ways that the gospel message was able to be received. But at the same time, they didn't overlook the need for individual conversion and response to the gospel by instead focusing exclusively on social justice. One needs to look only to the example of someone like Saint Mother Teresa, who spent her entire life investing in individual people, picking them up off the ground, dying, and giving them dignity. When she was asked why, by an ABC News anchor, I wouldn't pick up one of these people for $1 million, referencing a man who literally had maggots falling out of his open wounds. And she responded to him masterfully. She said, I wouldn't do it for $1 million either, but I would do it for the love of Jesus Christ. This woman, who was an outsider in every way, shape, and form, by her gospel neighboring, reverberated the message of the gospel throughout a community that was even hostile to Christianity. In the end, when she would die, that country was so enamored with the witness and the message and the neighboring of Mother Teresa that they gave her a state funeral, bringing her coffin into town on the same carriage that brought Mahatma Gandhi's. And you can begin to understand that the power of being neighbor to one another, these outward kingdom priorities, can absolutely shape and give us credibility when we talk about gospel messaging. And so the two must always be intertwined. But there's another reason why they should be intertwined outside of the practical aspects of one reinforcing the other. And it's simply this. When Jesus Christ died for us and rose from the dead, God redeemed the body as well as the soul. That is why the Christian church has always been dedicated to both body and soul. Salvation is not one or the other. And so you find in social justice encyclicals of the church preaching the gospel, and you find in missionary encyclicals of the popes talking about social justice and concern for the poor. We can never separate the two because God, in redeeming us, did not separate the two. The incarnation of Christ, God taking on our human nature, means that the church is dedicated to the upbuilding and the development and the promoting of the development of all God's people because they bear His image and His likeness. When we turn then to the practical application of how we can have these outward kingdom priorities, there are three things that we need to keep in mind. They are the biblical foundations of Christian social justice. And it's simply this. One, love your neighbor. Jesus completely radicalized the notion of neighbor through the telling of the story of the Good Samaritan. I'm sure we've all heard the story before, right? You read Luke's passage of the Good Samaritan, and Jesus is intentionally shocking his audience. He's trying to create a story that is so fantastic that it drives home one single point. So what do I mean by this? The parable of the Good Samaritan is about a Jewish man who's beaten by robbers and left stripped naked and left for dead. And three people come down the pathway. The first is a priest, the second a Levite. These are the top of Jewish society, both religiously and culturally. These men represented the very pinnacle of society. And then lastly, you have a Samaritan man, a man who in Jewish society would be regarded as the lowest of the low, often regarded as even lower than the Romans who were occupying the Holy Land at the time. That Jews and their hatred for Samaritans was so deep that many would cross, if they had a journey from Jerusalem north to Galilee, they would bypass Samaria by adding miles to their trip just so the dirt of that country would not get on their feet. And here Jesus is telling a made-up story, it's a parable, about this guy who was beaten and his co-religionists ignored him, right? His people who are ethnically his brothers ignored him. And yet here was a stranger who showed him mercy and love and justice. The point of the story of the Good Samaritan is this: Jesus radicalized the notion of neighbor. So my question to you is, who are you neighbor to? See, that's what Jesus did to the man in the story who was asking in order to justify himself. Who is my neighbor? Jesus turns the story around and says, who was neighbor to the man? Not who lived geographically close to him, and not who was his ethnic brother or bloodline related or any of that stuff. It was simply who was neighbor to him. And this all boils down to the bedrock foundation of Christianity, which is love your neighbor as yourself. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Well, if you were that man beaten and bloodied and left for dead, wouldn't you want someone to come along the way to help you, to dress your wounds, to provide aid and comfort? So too ought you to do that for other people. So when Jesus took the term neighbor, and you can find this throughout the rest of the New Testament, he didn't just mean, go and help the poor in some pietistic way. He meant that those who lack basic human goods are your neighbor that you must serve. You must be neighbor to the broken, the lost, and the hurting. And then we have the next step. The next step is this notion of biblical service. At the time of Christ, in that society, in first century Palestine, the notion of service, the Greek word diakosune, was considered to be one of the lowest forms of servant work or slave work. Someone who exercised Christian service was someone who the term literally means one who waits at tables. And so Jesus Christ says the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. Right? He's driving our attention to this very bedrock foundation of Christianity, which is my relationship to the community and to people around me and to my church family is one of diakosune, service. Not just any type of service, but the lowest of the low, which he embodied in his example of washing the feet of the 12 apostles. Right? That was a service that he rendered to his apostles that was deemed so lowly and so despised that not even Jewish slaves in the first century would wash the feet of their masters. And so here we have Jesus saying, this is an example that I have given for you. Next, we have the notion of doing justice. So the first one is expansion of the term neighbor. The second one is this fundamental understanding of Christian service. And lastly is doing justice. For many of us, when we read about justice or righteousness or rightness in Scripture, we tend to think of it in terms of our relationship with God. But that was not the case in the Old Testament understanding, and Jesus only emphasized that even to a greater measure in the New Testament. When we look at the Old Testament understanding of doing justice, biblical scholars will tell you that kind of the crowning notion of a just man in Jewish society was one who was willing to disadvantage himself in order to benefit the community. And the wicked man was one who was willing to disadvantage the community in order to benefit himself. Because within the Christian and Jewish worldview, within a biblical worldview, just because we are not related in terms of immediate family did not mean I didn't have responsibility for you and you for me. An outward kingdom priority means that I am not just in a neighborhood, I'm investing to that neighborhood. I'm investing in the people of that neighborhood. I want to be a part of and see the blossoming of and the flourishing of that neighborhood. Being a part of a community means more than just having your residence there, just like being a neighbor means more than just geographic location. And when we look at this notion of doing justice in the New Testament, the the writer of 1 John will go so far as to say, if you see your brother in need and you neglect his basic needs, how can you even call yourself a Christian? In 1 John chapter 3 and again in 1 John chapter 4, they'll go on to say, how can someone say, I love God but hate his brother? If someone loves God who he doesn't see and hates his brother that he does see, he said that the truth is not in him, that he is a liar and the truth is not in him. Using these very harsh words, we can come to a better and final understanding of what it means to live out Christian charity, justice, and mercy, these outward kingdom priorities to those around us. It means simply this, that someone cannot say, I'm right with God when someone's wrong with their neighbor. Christ, and building us and giving us the church and setting us up to build up the kingdom of God on earth, gave us these priorities that all men and all women are our responsibility, whether or not they belong to the household of faith. And so you find in the early church, at the time of the emperor, the apostate Julian, he would write to his pagan priests in Rome saying, do you see these Galileans? Do you see how they take care of even our poor? That not one Jewish person goes hungry, none of our people go hungry, and if they're not being fed by us, they're not being fed by the pagan powers, the pagan priests, and the pagan emperor Julian. They're being fed by these Galileans, these Christians, then known as the atheists, because they rejected the Roman gods. It was this credibility, it was this gospel neighboring on the ground level, the Christians who saw that I should disadvantage myself in order to benefit others, even those who don't belong to my church, my group, my people, my tribe, whatever. That became one of the greatest proclamations of the gospel. So as we summarize this, what do we need to say? Number one, basically God cares more about your character than he does about your comfort. We live today in a gospel where the American dream competes with the teachings of Jesus Christ. And it's my hope that you can hear that following Jesus Christ means you have to love those that Christ loved. It means loving and serving the poor around us. Not just the poor, but doing justice to everyone. So Christians need to be committed to number one, immediate relief. That's the initial care. That's what the church can provide. That's why church builds soup kitchens, food pantries, and housing for the homeless and the orphans. But even more than direct relief is the next step, which would be development. Serving the individual and communities by helping them reach a level of self-sufficiency. That's ongoing development. That's what the church can provide as well, the local church, in partnering with other people. Finally, something that probably is bigger than the local church, which is what we would call reform. At a legal level, a political level, a moral level, community levels, policies, and regulations. Actually, Christians motivated by the gospel need to try to build a more just society. It is not our place just to give a handout to someone. It is our place to work for broader systemic reforms. By doing all these things for the glory of Jesus Christ, we unite gospel messaging with gospel neighboring. God love you.